Hello, my name is Jaycee Zamarripa, and the city I chose to present on today is New York City. So, firstly, why I chose this city. I chose this city because ever since I was younger and I watched my favorite movies and TV shows that featured New York City, such as Friends, I wanted to travel there. I always thought it looked so fun and so awesome to be there. Um, I also think there's just so much history attached to New York City and the state of New York alone, obviously, as it was one of the first 13 colonies and one of the first places settled in America. I always find stuff like that fascinating just to think about how old it is and how much it's changed and how much of an impact it's had on our country. And so I just love it for that reason. But I also think visually it's stunning. I think that the buildings are so cool. I know a lot of people prefer nature and trees, which I 110% agree with. I think nature is beautiful, but I think that the city can be beautiful in its own way as well. So, New York City is not that geographically diverse. I would say New York State is, as there's, you know, beaches, and then there's also forests and countryside. But New York City itself is not really that diverse. It's mostly bedrock, and the bedrock is a great foundation to be able to withstand and hold all of the skyscrapers and gigantic buildings up. Um, New York City is divided into five separate boroughs, which are the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island. All five of them are super diverse and different, and we will specifically talk about each one more later on. Um, and New York City does have the unique advantage, I would say, of sitting right where the Atlantic Ocean and the Hudson River meet, which aided in the trade. So here, this slide, I just wanted to show some maps. The first one I thought to be really cool and really helpful because it kind of just gives you a very simplistic like visual of how the boroughs are divided. Um, so you see Staten Island, Brooklyn with Queens above it, running along with Manhattan, and then the Bronx. And then the second photo I thought was really cool because it's a satellite image. It might be a little hard to see, but I thought it provided a good perspective of not only the buildings and stuff, but also another perspective of how the river runs along Manhattan and, New York City. This last photo of the map, the densely populated map, the density population, I thought that this was cool because it could show you, where people were the most located and where they were the least located. And this says 2015, but most of the things I was looking at showed the same thing, and this is one of the places where I could get the for sure source. So I will say I think it's still mostly the same with Manhattan being mostly populated and Staten Island being the least populated. So the first borough we'll be talking about is the Bronx, and it is located further north than any of the other boroughs, as you can see from the last map. This was an area that did have a big part in the American Revolution. A lot of the conflict took place there. After the war, however, the Bronx was an area used for summer homes by wealthy people, and it grew rapidly. But there was an area where poverty and crime began to raise, and that growth slowed and caused a detriment. But over the years, efforts were made to make improvements to the area of the Bronx, and it has helped. But of course, there's still people who could use help to be brought out of poverty, and there's still many more improvements that can be made. So the next borough we'll be talking about is Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is the most populous of all of the boroughs. Um, It was also a significant area during the American Revolution. The Battle of Long Island took place there. Um, so I kind of got the sense that Brooklyn was a place that was always financially thriving, and it was always an area where, economic opportunities were available, and they were good. But that doesn't mean that people were not still struggling and that there weren't people who were affected by poverty, because of course there are, and there's people who did not have the same advantages to be able to thrive like others did in Brooklyn. So here we got Manhattan. Manhattan is the smallest of the boroughs, but that does not stop it from being huge in any way, uh, or busy. It is considered, to me and I'm sure many others, to be the heart of the financial, business, and administrative corporations in America, the biggest ones. It's, of course, where the famous Wall Street is located. Um, so clearly, there's a huge difference, I mean, a vast difference between the rich and the poor here, and it's a lot more obvious here than it is in the other boroughs. So much so that it's almost, it's like the rich people live in these big, huge houses and, don't, I'm sure they don't worry about much financially, and then the poor people, are struggling to get by and just living with what they can, and it's really unfortunate. All right, so now we have Queens. So by area, Queens is the largest borough. So um, a battle that happened here was a fight for religious freedom, which I actually did not know this, surprisingly. I don't know if I forgot it from history class earlier on, but I did not know this. But the fight for religious freedom in the year of 1657, and it was called the Battle of the Flushing Remonstrance. Now, Queens is also known for its incredible diversity. It has the highest percentage of immigrants living there over any of the other boroughs. And it is also made up of a large middle class. Go Queens. So, the last of the boroughs we have is Staten Island. Now, Staten Island is least densely populated, and it is the least urban of the New York City boroughs. So things are a little more spread out here than they are in some of the other areas. Um, Staten Island did have a small industrial period, but it wasn't huge like some of the other places, and it only led to a small growth in the population. And then when that died out, some people obviously still stayed behind. Uh, but its biggest form of transportation uh, to get to New York City is using the Staten Island Ferry. Now, Staten Island is the least ethnically diverse of all of the boroughs and the most politically conservative. But to me, that makes sense because it's kind of isolated off by itself from the rest of uh, NYC. All right, let's talk about the weather of New York City. So, the weather, it can vary a lot. Tends to be wetter than it is drier. So, the annual precipitation sits at around 44 inches per year. So, as we all know, New York City gets beautiful snowstorms. I think it's one of the main reasons that people want to go there in the winter time or the Christmas time is just because of how beautiful it is. Something I was surprised to learn is that the summer can be quite hot there and miserable, as some people have said. Some people have theorized, at least that I've heard from like podcasts, that maybe it's so hot because there's less trees and the buildings don't quite offer the same shade that trees do, so you can't hide from the sun. So let's talk about some of the average temperatures. The average temperature in the winter ranges from 28 degrees to 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, it can get colder and hotter than this. And then the hottest temperature in the summer ranges, the temperatures range from 72 to 75 degrees. And again, it can get much hotter than this. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about the history. So, initially on voyages, it was discovered by Giovanna da Verrazano and Henry Hudson. They kind of sailed by and saw it and discovered there was land there, but nobody officially settled there until 1926, in which the Dutch West India Company had sent families to live and establish life there. They originally had called it New Amsterdam. Now, eventually, a man named Peter Minuit had purchased the area of Manhattan, which is the original New York, from Native Americans for trade goods. However, I think I saw the equivalent was only like $24. He severely underpaid them and did not give them what that land was worth, especially as we can see now. But it's no surprise that Native Americans were mistreated. So, we can talk about the culture now. So, I don't think that there's just one specific culture of New York City, right? You can't just say that there's this one thing that all of New York City does, because it's so incredibly diverse that there's so many cultures that make it up. Um, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so beautiful, is that you can go to Chinatown, or you can go to Black Harlem, Spanish Harlem, and it's going to be so different. Again, like I mentioned earlier, even amongst just the boroughs themselves, the cultures are going to be extremely different. Um, and that's part of the reason why, many immigrants move there, is because of the opportunities and the amount of diversity that was welcomed there. And I would say that Americans have moved there for the same reasons. Americans may not get the same opportunities in the states they're in now. I think I would have some better opportunities being in New York than maybe I have being here in Oklahoma. So I keep mentioning this word called opportunities. Let's discuss what I mean a little bit. I believe, and I think many other people believe, that New York is a land of opportunities. It's famous for opportunities. It's the land of arts, such as painting, theater, music, anything in the arts that you can think of. I think it will strive here. Creativity shines here. Broadway, I've always wanted to go see a Broadway musical. But, if you're not into the art, there's still opportunities, places for you. New York City is also perfect for people in the business and, financial areas. Of course, like we said earlier, home to Wall Street, which houses the largest financial institutions in the nation. And outside of the economic things that are offered, I think there are lots of attractions that make tourists want to come, like the Statue of Liberty, um, Times Square, Madison Square Garden, everything, all the historical landmarks. But I think that outside of historical landmarks, people will still want to go to New York because of the feeling, the general feeling, and the vibes you get there. I think New York just offers that big city feeling. Okay, lastly, I'd like to talk about some of my key takeaways from doing this entire presentation. So, obviously, one of the big things I feel like I already knew, but what I had instilled even more from this is that it's just, it's got so much that you can do. And I say that, and I know that maybe that might sound out of touch, because I know that it's been a place, not everybody in America was always offered the same options and opportunities since the beginning that, maybe the straight white man was offered. But I do think we've come a long way, and while we still have quite a ways to go before things are, where they need to be for everybody, but I think just the progress we've made so far is shown in the amount of diversity that is seen there, and just the cultures that have been established, and, all of that. But I do think another huge issue of New York City is the poverty concern. I think that while we can talk about all the areas that strive and thrive all day, and how, the financial opportunities are great, and how it's home to Wall Street, I think it's also important to note that there's still an incredible difference between those who, you know, have money and don't, and that poverty is still a huge issue, and that the areas that are impoverished tend to be ignored by the government, and that we need to get the local leaders and governments to start paying attention to these areas so everybody can enjoy New York City in the same way. Lastly, here's just my slide of resources. There's quite a bit, so I'm sorry, but I have all the photos cited, and yeah, so thank you very much.